Good evening, everybody, and can I welcome everyone to the last lecture in this Assembly Commission series of 4 lectures marking this very significant year of centenaries 2021. Dr. Éamon Phoenix will once again be our guide through this final instalment, with Ann Donelly of NI Screen reprising her, dare I say, her key supporting role. For those joining us for the first time, the Perspectives On series is the initiative through which the Assembly Commission has agreed to mark the key centenaries over the last decade, and we're coming almost to the end of that. In doing so, we have been very clear about acknowledging and respecting all of the different views and perspectives that there are on these very significant events. For this year's significant centenaries, the Commission agreed that it was appropriate to have a series of lectures in which Éamon explore the events beginning in 1921 in some detail. I think it's very positive and indeed appropriate that the Commission has been facilitating this opportunity for discussion on these critical events from our shared history. In previous lectures, Éamon has presented the broader context of events from 1912 to 1925, shaped the political developments in Ireland at that time. Subsequent lectures then focused on both Unionist and the Loyalist leaderships and perspectives, and the nationalist and Republican perspectives on all of those unfolding events. Tonight, Éamon's lecture will mark the centenary of the first sitting of the old Stormont Parliament, which actually was marked last Monday on the 7th of June. Éamon will chart the history of that institution from its creation in 1921 until it was prorogued in 1972. And as always, at the end of the lecture, there will be some time open to the floor for a short period of questions and hopefully some comments as well. So during the lecture, please do feel free to enter any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll try and take a note and cover some of these at the end of the lecture. So without any further ado, can I now invite Éamon to commence tonight's lecture. Dr. Éamon Phoenix, please take the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Speaker Maskey, and thank you very much, Ann Donelly, for helping me this evening as ever. As we review, I hope, in the next hour, probably slightly less, 55 minutes, the very, very checkered history of the Stormont Government Parliament from the early 1920s, really, in 1921, to its prorogation, in fact, you might say, its abolition as the original devolved government of 1921, exactly 50 years later, in March 1972. And as the Speaker said, this is a week of some historical significance in the history of this place, because it was on the 7th of June, 1921, that the first meeting the new Parliament of Northern Ireland, set up under the Government of Ireland Act for the 6 counties, met in Belfast. And it met not in the City Hall, where the official launch in state would occur on the 22nd of June, a couple of weeks' time, but it occurred actually in Assemblies College, the Presbyterian Churches College in Botanic Avenue. And thanks to Anne, you're going to see James Craig. If we just freeze in there a second, because a quick recap, of course, James Craig was really the father of Ulster Unionism. He was the man who, in entering politics after an honourable career in the Boer War as a captain, he wanted to establish a homeland for his own people in the northeast corner of Ireland, which would ward off the dangers of a nationalist parliament in Dublin. And that would be if the Home Rule issue re-emerged and became a moving force. And that's exactly what happened, of course, after 1910 in British and Irish politics. So here we have Craig just stepping down as a junior minister in the British coalition government headed by Lord George, a man who is sure-footed in the corridors of Paul in London, grew up, of course, on the fringes of his father's boardroom. His father was a wealthy distiller with a large mansion in East Belfast. And this is his cabinet. And just freezing it there a second. There were 2 women elected to the Parliament. This is one of them. I think this is Dame Dara Chichester, who became a minister in the 40s as Dame Dara Parker. She was the aunt and predecessor in the seat of Major James Chichester Clark. You remember him as the second last Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. The elderly man with the bowler hat, he was a liberal unionist. This is Hugh MacDowell Pollock, a wealthy flour distiller, who was actually a close personal friend of the nationalist leader Joe Devlin. You have James Craig, of course, solid as Mourne granite, as someone said. He was determined to yield not an inch in protecting and conserving his 6 counties under British rule and unionist devolved government in the north. In the middle there, on Craig's right, you have J.M. Andrews. This is John Miller Andrews, the wealthy linen magnate from Cumber, one of the family who gave the son, of course, to the Titanic. Thomas Andrews, the designer who sunk with that ship. And in the background, we may see in a moment Lord Londonderry, a man from a different kidney, from the big house, Mount Stewart and North Down, who would have a very important career in British politics. He hasn't emerged yet, but we can see with a bow tie, we can see E.M. Archdale, the agriculture minister, but this is the somewhat imperious looking 7th Marquis of Londonderry, a man who someone said had 1 foot in the 18th century, who tended to wear frock coats to Parliament, but 1 foot also in the 23rd century. He envisioned a non-sectarian system of education with mixed schools, something which of course hit the buffers when the main churches opposed it in the mid-1920s, and he eventually left local politics for his career as their minister in Britain. But here's Lord Londonderry. He was elected, he wasn't elected to the House of Commons, he was a member of the Senate, and therefore he didn't have to worry about a constituency base until his retirement in 1926. So we have that, and this of course is the first parliament which met, we can say, just exactly a century ago. And no one knew then, of course, how long it was going to last. Ireland was still in turmoil. Sinn Féin had secured successive majorities, not just in the 1918 election on the whole island, but in the local elections and indeed in the southern elections of May 1921, when 120 Sinn Féin members were returned unopposed. So the demand for independence, expressed as a demand for an all-Ireland republic, was still there. The IRA campaign was continuing. Men were being hanged in early June 1921 by the British Crown for the carrying of arms in Dublin and Cork. And of course, you had the Blind Hand and the auxiliary, the reprisals. British public opinion is changing. And the British cabinet, which is a coalition dominated by the Tories, who are friends of Craig and Ulster, but also including Liberals headed by Lord George, they're asking themselves the indomitable question, can this war continue in Ireland? Is it practical politics to have concentration camps, 200,000 troops, or are they going, and military law, or are they going to have to seek a resolution of the problem? And of course, that resolution occurs the following week when the King, of course, opens the Northern Ireland Parliament and State on the 22nd of June, I should say towards the end of June. And the King makes his famous speech in Belfast City Hall. Now, of course, this was a high-risk visit by the British monarch. His advisors counselled against coming to Belfast, which had a reputation for intense sectarian violence. 450 people would die in this city of Belfast between 1920 and 1922, most of them civilians. So it was very much a war zone. And in the weeks following the King's visit, hundreds of houses were burned in sectarian rioting in the city. The King came, and his speech had been heavily influenced by not just Lord George, but particularly by the South African Prime Minister, General Jan Christian Smuts. That's important. Smuts had been a rebel against the British Crown in South Africa and had become the Prime Minister of a South African dominion within the British Commonwealth. He was in touch with De Valera. He was counselling De Valera to seek a united Irish Republic slowly, gradually, and to accept a substantial increment of independence, which would be offered under Dominion status. The King, that famous day in Belfast City Hall, and I know that the King's speech is going to be dramatised on the 22nd of June, and the talk that I gave has actually been recorded on the significance of the event. And the King called on Irishmen to forgive and forget, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, and to seek for the land that they love, whether under one parliament or two, as the Irish people themselves might decide, a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill. That would open the path for negotiations. It would lead to a treaty in 1921. establishing a 26-county free state and leaving the north intact. But of course, it was subject to a boundary commission, a proposal to revise the borders. And nationalists will even include Fermanagh, Tyrone, Derry, Londonderry, and Newry in the new Irish Free State. Unionists feared, of course, the dismemberment of their province, and Craig declared not an inch. So all of that lies ahead. But of course, the Boundary Commission collapses in 1920, but not before there's considerable violence in the border. We just get a sense of that as Anne screens now the battles of Ballick and Pettigo in early June 1922. This is just 99 years ago, just a year after the establishment of the Belfast Parliament. And of course, a hard border has been established as violence flares in the border and is, if you like, echoed on the streets of Belfast. But I want you to get a sense of this. Churchill sends in the artillery when the IRA infringe Northern Territory at Ballick. Pettigo is a divided village between Fermanagh and Donegal. Remember, this is a border nobody expected to be there only a decade earlier. Local farmers, local people, the two governments are finding it difficult to come to terms with this new line in the map. But of course, Churchill sends in the artillery to defend the Northern Ireland border. By this stage, having been a Home Ruler, he's now a friend of Ulster Unionism. And Ballick is shelled by troops who arrive with artillery. You can see this is incredible on a hot summer's day in June 1922. And it's like a scene from the Western Front, as we may have said before, as you watch this in slow motion. Ballick Fort, a military emplacement overlooking the Fermanagh village, was actually a few yards into Donegal. You can see the generals entering Donegal, accompanied by a military, a civilian attaché, Sir Basil Brooke, an ex-World War I officer and future Unionist Prime Minister. And of course, they have now checked the advance of the IRA quite bloodily. And of course, the British will occupy Pettigo, this mainly Unionist village, until 1923. Only leaving at the very last minute. And of course, this is a time when people are moving north and south as the border settles down. Violence is continuing because the question mark of uncertainty is over the whole thing. But of course, by 1925, if we just freeze it there, the border has been confirmed because the Boundary Commission set up under the treaty meets in 1924-25, led by a South African judge, an Englishman, Mr. Justice Feetham, with a northern representative and a Free State representative. They tour the border, but the only major recommendations it makes is that South Armagh, including Crossmaglen, will go into the Free State, and that a large and very arable part of East Donegal, a mainly Unionist area called the Lagan, between the Maiden City and Letterkenny, with villages like Newton, Cunningham, and Burt, it will be transferred to its natural, I suppose, city, Derry. And of course, all hell breaks loose in the Free State. The Boundary Commission is eventually shelved. It's hidden for 50 years before it's released in 1969. And the border is confirmed. The Council of Ireland, which had been part of the 1920 arrangements, finally disappears. And of course, the South accept financial concessions. And what had been the seat of the trouble, the Eastern boundary, as they call it then. You hear words like border and frontier and boundary and line on the map. But perhaps we should see it as a line in people's minds. Because, of course, no matter where it was drawn, and that was certainly going to be disputed, it reflected, if you like, two views of where Ireland should be and where the North, Ulster, or most of it should be. By 1920. So we have that situation. Of course, Stormont is legislating during this period. And remember, when the major legislation is being led down by Craig and his cabinet, not in Stormont, but in Botanic Avenue, in these years of cabinet we saw, they are laying down the framework of the new dispensation, of the new polity of Northern Ireland, without any input from the one-third nationalist minority. Joe Devlin and Éamon Phoenix had signed a pact in 1921, refusing to acknowledge the partition parliament. And of course, this is reinforced by Michael Collins's non-recognition policies in 1922, and the question mark continues. So it's not really until 1925 that Craig can declare that his not an inch policy has succeeded. And that leaves a very bitter, a very sullen, a very resentful nationalist minority. If you read the accounts of nationalism in this period, particularly their delegations to Dublin to meet Collins in 1922, those long memorandums read like the, if you like, testament of a defeated people. They had opposed partition, they had never contemplated a place called Northern Ireland or being part of it. And they suddenly found themselves, even in South Fermanagh, even in the Bogside, corralled in this new entity. We have said before, of course, that historians see the Ulster Unionists of the day as reflecting the kind of characteristics of European nationalists, like the Poles, like the Slavs, who were inclined to demand more territory than they were entitled to in their state-building efforts. And so you have these buffer zones like South Fermanagh, South Armagh, West Tyrone, the historic city of Derry/Londonderry being brought in, often for not so much economic reasons, but cultural reasons. For example, separating Derry from Donegal made absolutely no sense. It was composed of people who had come in as the landless labourers, one unionist writer put it, from the wilds of Donegal. It was the railway centre, the industrial centre, the marketing centre for Northwest Ireland. But unionist politician Thomas Mull said it was also an Irish Thermopylae. Now, that's not something trips off anybody's lips in this audience any day of the week. What he meant was that's where the martyrs of siege of 1689 lay. And so on that historic ground, Derry must be brought in. Big problems for unionism, because most of the unionist ruling class lived in County Donegal, in places like Carrigans and Difford, in their big houses. And they were going to be separated. Hence the move to bring East Donegal into the north after 1922, which ultimately, of course, was set aside and the old border confirmed. What of nationalism in these years? Well, we're going to look at a piece of footage here of the nationalist leader, Joe Devlin. Devlin, of course, this is June 1925, so all of these events are actually being marked this month in one way or another. But Joe Devlin, of course, was a seasoned parliamentarian. One of the deputy leaders of the Home Rule Party, a man who might have had a great career under Home Rule had things gone differently after 1912. But Joe Devlin, of course, had been returned for West Belfast and County Antrim in 1920, and he was by nature a participant. He didn't really believe in abstentionism. You can see on the platform there, he's now speaking. And this is wee Joe Devlin. He's now in his mid-50s, the darling of the mill girls. In 1925, the Protestant and Catholic working classes voted for wee Joe en masse. He was a brilliant orator. In the tradition of the Carsons and the Redmonds of the period, a much better orator than Craig, a great organizer, and he led the ancient order of Hibernians. But while he was responsible for the Catholic vote in the days of nationalist strength across the north of Ireland, he had strong anti-sectarian instincts, and he wanted to get into Parliament at the earliest opportunity to build bridges to the independent unionists, the Labour Party and others, and therefore try, if you like, to create a kind of popular front that would pursue radical social policies on things like old age pensions and social conditions and all that kind of thing. So, and can I tell you how Belfast got round its divisions after really a 2-year civil war by 1925? They had a Celtic carnival. We hear a lot today about Irish and Ulster Scots, but they had a Celtic carnival in Belfast, which allowed people, whether they were Gaelic Irish or Lowland Scots or Highland Scots, to celebrate their Celtic links. And there you have Joe Devlin at that particular time. But of course, this is a period, of course, when the nationalists, by 1925, Devlin has taken lead with a colleague. It's not until 1927 that the border nationalists, Cara Healy from Fermanagh, J.J. McCarroll, the editor of the Derry Journal from Foyle, begin to take the seats. And you have a 10 or 11 strong nationalist opposition in College Green. But they have arrived too late, because the framework has been laid for example, Law and Order, the Special Powers Act was passed in 1922, which was based on the draconian legislation introduced during the Black and Tan War by Westminster, and of course allowed for internment without trial, and indeed the suppression of newspapers, and the exclusion orders against suspect politicians, Éamon Phoenix, for example. You also had, of course, the Education Act. The Catholic Church had opposed Londonderry policy of secular schools. So had the Protestant churches, but they had representatives in Parliament, and they were able to argue for concessions by 1925. And by 1925, Londonderry's image of non-sectarian, non-denominational schools with religion left outside the normal school day and provided on the basis of parental consent by the respective clergymen, that was beginning to fall apart. And what the Protestant churches in the Concordat of 1925 from James Craig was Protestant teachers were Protestant pupils and a controlling interest in schools that they had handed over to the state, be they Presbyterian or Church of Ireland or whatever. This led, of course, to what was known as the endowment of Protestantism by the state, because state schools were 99% Protestant and were controlled by the Protestant churches who appointed the teachers. The Catholic schools, of course, had opted out. They got no grants at all in the 1920s, though teacher salaries were paid. And it wasn't until 1930 that Devlin and the nationalist opposition campaigned during the debates on the 1930 Stormont Education Act, and they got 50% grants for voluntary, mainly Catholic schools. There were a few Protestant volunteers like Methodist College, as people would be aware, like up to the present day. So education was laid down, and of course, the big one was the abolition of PR, proportional representation. Craig had wanted to do this from the beginning. He saw it as un-British, but he also saw it as weakening the hand of unionism west of the Bann, where you had small Catholic majorities in the border counties. Of course, that would lead to the abolition of PR for local elections, and what Michael Collins called at the time an attempt to paint Tyrone and Fermanagh with a deep orange tint in advance of the Boundary Commission. Now, of course, Craig had promised he was going to abolish PR for Northern Ireland parliamentary elections, we would say today assembly elections, and this was done finally in 1929. So as Devlin and the Nationalists took the seats, they were facing the abolition of PR. It was opposed by Devlin, by Labour, by Independents, but of course Craig said he wanted two parties in the House, one pro-union and one seeking this amalgamation of Northern Ireland in a Dublin Parliament. And of course, PR was abolished, and that led to a frozen political system. After 1929, the first elections on the first past the post, politics were born. A limited number of constituencies only were contested. To have a seat was to have a seat for life, virtually. So you had safe national seats like South Fermanagh or Mid Antrim, where really there was never much opposition at all in the 50 years of Stormont rule. And so when we had election counts in the 50s or 60s and people stood up all night, well, they didn't really. It was over quite quickly because there were very few contested seats until, of course, the crisis election of 1969, which is another story. How successful were the Nationalists? I've talked about Devlin's success in amending the Education Act, but it was more successful there because the Catholic Church had threatened to test the Northern Ireland Educational Code at Westminster before the House of Lords, where it would almost certainly have been discovered to be ultra vires illegal because it breached the Government of Ireland Act's religious safeguard. So Craig was taking the line of least resistance. But apart from that, the only act the Nationalists succeeded in getting through in their 5 years of constitutional opposition, attending every day, people like Devlin and Cahir Healy, the Fermanagh former Sinn Féin politician, was the Wild Birds Protection Act of 1931. It wasn't reassuring, and in 1932, Devlin led his supporters out of the House of Commons forever in October 1932. He never actually sat in Stormont, though his name is always associated with the early opposition, constitutional opposition to unionist rule. When Devlin died in 1934, James Craig, his old sparring partner from Westminster Days, paid tribute to Wee Joe as a lion of the underdog, a defender of the underdog. And when Devlin's funeral went up the Falls Road in January 1934, it was said that Ireland was united for one day, as you had unionist cabinet ministers shouldering the coffin, cheek by jowl, with the son of Éamon de Valera, and of course Tommy Henderson, an independent unionist from Shankill, who insisted on carrying the coffin past Dover Street, because he said as a boy in the 1880s and early 1900s, he had stoned Joe Devlin's procession going up the Falls Road, and he was making amends. Devlin was a very, very popular figure, and would met Craig privately to get small things done. But it was the big things that really were not done. The problem is we move into the 1930s now. And the 1930s, of course, are marked, first of all, by the opening of the gleaming new Parliament buildings at Stormont in October 1932. Anne will show a brilliant bit of footage of this as the Prince of Wales, the future and soon to, if you like, abdicate, Edward VIII, arrives in Stormont in a very bad mood, it was said. He just had a row with his father about his love affair with the American divorcee, Wallace Simpson, because obviously if a politician's face doesn't look too happy, it doesn't necessarily mean he's at war with his colleagues at Stormont. It can suggest he's had a row with a wife. But anyway, he arrives in the royal yacht. This is a reprise of 1921 and George V's visit. And there is the Prince of Wales arriving, and he's going to open this grand new Parliament building at Ballymiscaw, as you probably know, the townland of Ballymiscaw in the Craigantlett Hills, on the site of the old Stormont, the Cleland Castle going back to the 18th century, which of course stood where the present Stormont Castle stands. And there you have the crowds gathering, an honour guard of Ulster Specials, Craig's pride and joy. He saw them as the defenders of the state in the troubled times of 1921. And the Prince opens Parliament. My friend Jimmy Kelly remembered that day. He said, amidst all the pomp and ceremonies, suddenly there was a terrible crash in the Great Hall. And one of the waitresses had dropped a crock of crockery. Jimmy was the Darling of Irish journalism, and there were sort of angry cries of "sack that woman!" That would never happen today. And of course, Stormont is opened in state. It was, as H.M. Pollock, the Liberal Unionist Minister of Finance, put it, it was a symbol of the permanency of our institution. It looked as though now Stormont was really, it had not only acquired the vested interests of the civil service and the judiciary and the police force, but it now had this, if you like, world-class Parliament building at Stormont, with, of course, the two chambers, the House of Commons and, of course, the Senate chamber, which remains today, is original from this period. James Craig had been elevated to the Viscountcy as Lord Craigavon in 1927, and he would reign as Prime Minister for another 8 years until his death in 1940. But the 1930s, of course, are described by economic historians and indeed political historians worldwide as the devil's decade, because this was the period of the rise of the dictators, Mussolini and particularly Hitler, of course, the establishment of the Third Reich, Hitler's aggressive foreign policy, and the massive economic problems that flowed from the Wall Street crash of 1929, the soaring unemployment, the Jarrow March in Britain, and of course this poverty and unemployment, insanitary housing, most of it post-famine Victorian housing in Belfast, which was damp, which fostered diseases like TB, and of course, the result was that, of course, the many men were thrown out of work. The mills were in half-time. The shipyard was shrinking. No ships were being built in the early 30s. The wee yard, Workman Clark, closed in 35. So we have a sense they marched from Templemore Avenue in the east, from the Shank, from the Falls, on the workhouse on the Lisbon Road, demanding and singing the only popular song that could unite them, "Yes, we have no bananas." And of course, this led to rioting. 2 men were shot dead. Eventually, the government intervened and the outdoor relief allowance was raised. It had been the lowest in the United Kingdom, far lower than in Liverpool or Manchester. And it was a starvation wage for men who couldn't get work at that period. So this is a very, very serious period when 26% of the Northern Ireland workforce was unemployed. Only Wales had a worse record at that particular time. Of course, the powers of the Unionist government were highly limited. They couldn't, sort of raise and spend. They had only control over 1 or 2 minor taxes. Taxation rested with Westminster under the 1920 Constitution. So you had all those problems as well. And we have a sense of people, well, of course, we're moving on because this was a decade, just phrasing it there a second, Anne, a decade of sectarian rhetoric and sectarian violence. The nationalist community, which had been led by Joe Devlin in the 1930s, was now largely represented by abstentionist politicians. The IRA was reviving in the 30s in Ireland, north and south. De Valera finally, if you like, prescribed them in 1935 and came down very heavily on the IRA. But there was to be a campaign north of the border during the Second World War, a small spluttering campaign. They never had the support of the entire nationalist population. And in Belfast, the Catholic population was beginning to move leftwards towards politicians like Harry Diamond and later Jerry Fitt. But of course, they were a state within a state. They had their own social and cultural infrastructure, Catholic schools, a Catholic hospital, the Mater in North Belfast. They had, of course, their own newspapers, their own cultural activities, the Irish language. So nationalists tended to look to Dublin. Both parts of Ireland were equally poor as the pro-Free State or the pro-Treaty Cosgrave government gave way to Éamon de Valera's new Fianna Fáil government, which prioritised Irish unity and the Irish language in 1932. And we can see here we're moving into the riots of 1935. The riots of 1935 saw, of course, serious sectarian rioting in the city. This was the anniversary of the King's. This was the King's Jubilee. Rioting broke out at the 12th. And at the end, 11 people died, and something like 300 houses were burned to the ground in 1935. The Nationalist Party tried to raise the matter with Westminster, but the Prime Minister was Stanley Baldwin, a Conservative heading a national government. But Baldwin did not intervene. And that reminds us of something else. From 1922, the Speaker at Westminster had effectively ruled debates on what was happening here out of order. A future Labour Home Secretary, Tutor Eade, said in 1949, Northern Ireland affairs are no business of ours, even though the Home Office in London dealt with Stormont, as well as London taxi cabs, dog licenses, and a whole lot of other things. But as my friend James Kelly, who was a working journalist until he died at the age of 100, used to tell me, when he went to Westminster occasionally and was brought into the lobby by his journalistic friends, he used to say in the 1930s, and Jimmy was from West Belfast, this is Jimmy Kelly, who comes from a faraway country of which we know nothing. And of course, he was echoing the words of course, Neville Chamberlain, the pre-war Prime Minister, who had talked about Czechoslovakia as a faraway country. So we have a sense of that. What's the background to all this? Polarization, sectarian tensions after 1932, highlighted by poverty and unemployment, sectarian speeches. Were the norm in the 1930s. Craigavon's speech a few months into the opening of Stormont in 1934, ours is a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state. Cardinal MacRory's statement in 1931, the Protestant churches are not even part of the true Church of Christ. Basil Brooke in 1933 at a 12th of July demonstration urged Protestants not to employ Catholic lads and lassies because, quote, they were out to cut their throat and were 99% disloyal. And we could continue. Dawson Bates, the Minister of Home Affairs, who was a very narrow-minded man, described by Churchill's agent in Belfast in 1922 as a narrow and bitter partisan. Dawson Bates regarded all Catholics as nationalists, all nationalists as enemies, and in the early 30s refused to use a telephone at Stormont. They heard that a Catholic telephonist had been appointed. I actually met the lady. She was Joe Devlin's secretary, and in old age I met her, and she could never understand how she was a highly competent secretary. And she said, you know, I was there a few months, I was getting on great, and then I was sacked. She was sacked on the executive order. This is Dawson Bates. Now, another civil servant, very much a low-grade civil servant at that time, was Patrick Shea. Patrick Shea was a product of the Christian Brothers School in Newry. His father was a police sergeant in the old RIC. He joined the Northern Ireland Civil Service, but he was told by a sympathetic head of that civil service, Colonel Spender, that he needn't expect promotion. given his name and his background. In fact, he was to become the first permanent secretary from A.N. Bonaparte was in the 1920s, when he became permanent secretary of education in 1969 in his last few months in office. So we have a problem here that only 5% of the upper ranks of the Stormont civil service was Catholic at this time. And it's a very, very bitter decade in which you have an IRA revival. You have the Ulster Protestant League, led by an independent unionist MP, arguing for the exclusion of men names like Kelly and Sullivan from the police force, because many of the old RIC had joined the RUC. Remember, a third of the places were reserved for Catholics. And for the first 10 or 15 years, 17% of the RUC were old RIC men from places like Cork and Mayo. But then as they retired, they were not replaced. And of course, the Ulster Special Constabulary, thinned down from 1925, remained a 10,000 strong force down to the 1960s. We're moving, of course, towards people were emigrating to Northern Ireland at that time. De Valera comes to power in the south. Let's have a quick sense of De Valera, and you can see De Valera at the outset of the Second World War. Dev had negotiated a new agreement with Chamberlain. He got back the ports, which had been reserved to Britain under the treaty at Lough Swilly and Cork Harbour. But of course, you can see there are some IRA incidents here. You'll see a train derailed in the early 1930s. And you will see De Valera, who really crushes the IRA at several points in his career. He no longer has any use for the IRA. And of course, De Valera, he becomes the symbol of the era he bestrode between the Treaty of 1921 and his retirement from the presidency in 1973. It's like Éamon Paisley's, it's a huge political career. And like Éamon Paisley, he was a polarizing figure. People either loved him or disliked him intensely. And here we have De Valera. And of course, he renamed the state Era. He adopted a constitution in 1937, which laid claim to the 6 counties, the famous Article 2 and 3. But it may have laid claim to them, but it made it very clear that the Irish Parliament had no jurisdiction here until the reintegration of the national territory, quote unquote. De Valera, of course, insisted on a neutral policy in the Second World War, disappointing the hopes of Chamberlain and his replacement Churchill. And we're going to hear, I think, a bit of footage from a documentary on this period. Maybe we're not. So it's probably, you can see, of course, that you can see the impact of the Second World War in Northern Ireland. Conscription didn't apply here. Craig had asked for it. It was rejected twice by the British government. People volunteered to join. And this is the Irish Army in the 26 counties with their German-style helmets. This was a policy, of course, of benevolent neutrality, because De Valera opened the Donegal corridor up to overflying RAF planes from Lough Erne and indeed the northwest airfields. Although Churchill threatened to come to close quarters with De Valera in the war years because he refused to make his ports available to the Allies. And that reminds us of something else, of course. Churchill made his famous offer in June 1940. Think about it. France had fallen. And of course, the Germans had arrived in the Channel Islands. It looked as though Britain would succumb to the Nazi yoke. Churchill made a final appeal to De Valera to join the Allies, make his ports available to Britain and the Allies. And of course, he offered a united Ireland in return. Negotiations would be set on foot between North and South to establish a defensive council, and this would evolve into a united Ireland. The man who stopped it was Éamon de Valera himself. He didn't trust Churchill, going back to the Irish Civil War, and he also felt that Hitler was likely to win the war, and he would find himself, his small state, being bombarded by the Luftwaffe to no real end. He also, of course, felt that Craigavon would, if you like, frustrate attempts to reunite Ireland. Craigavon, of course, in the last year of his life, was incandescent with Ray, and he said, such base treachery, loyal Ulster cannot be apart. So this was Churchill's offer. Remember, he had been a home ruler in 1912-14. He became a supporter of Northern Ireland in the early 20s, and now, of course, he was abandoning that. And we can see Churchill, of course, in his career as a British cabinet minister, his answer to De Valera. He's entering the town hall at Inverness. Hopefully he didn't meet Nicola Sturgeon. She wouldn't have been there at that stage. But he's entering the town hall at Inverness in this famous picture. And we have a sense of Churchill. Remember, when he assumed power in 1940, it was most unexpected. He'd been in the wilderness, accused of being a warmonger in the 30s when he warned of the danger of appeasement. And this is the Churchill who eyeballed De Valera. President Roosevelt got involved as well, tried to put pressure on the era government to no real avail. Though De Valera obviously removed the transmitter from the German embassy, and indeed he allowed weather reports to be sent from the west of Ireland to assist the RAF and all that kind of thing. He also allowed Southern Irishmen to join the armed forces in the north, so they came to Belfast and joined the army, the RAF. Something like 38,000 citizens of Northern Ireland joined up, but of course something like 58,000 Southerners joined up, and they won 11 of the 12 VCs for the island of Ireland, as it happened during the war. The ship, of course, invoking the South, and of course this Irish volunteer to the British forces saying that De Valera should have been shot. But what he's talking about, of course, is Dev's decision to present condolences to the German legation in Dublin in May 1945 on the death of Hitler. This was a major mistake, typical De Valera mathematical efficiency in delivering neutrality. And of course, it was to alienate British public opinion, the major British parties, from independent Ireland for at least a decade, and also damage relations with America at that particular time. In the north, of course, this is the era of the Second World War. We'll have to cut down what we were going to show you, but we can show you, I think, Prime Minister Andrews arguing that Ireland can't be neutral in war. No part of Ireland can be neutral. This is J.M. Andrews, the linen magnate, who succeeded Craig as Prime Minister, but was arrested after the horrors of the Belfast Blitz, which he had failed to present. J.M. Andrews around 1941. The clipped Ulster tones of J.M. Andrews, really a man from the same stable as James Craig, were both industrialists by family background, and both very much centralised in the Ulster Unionist Party and the Orange Order. But of course, he failed to prevent the Blitz, and of course, the Blitz was to result in the death of 900 people on Easter Tuesday 1941. And of course, Belfast sort of slum housing from the famine period was of course wiped out. 53% of the housing stock was destroyed. And of course the Germans took taken the waterworks for the shipyard, heavy bombing in North Belfast. So, I mean, there's so much going on in the Second World War. You have no conscription. There is a lack of something that Howard Wilson, as a manpower civil servant from Britain, picked up on. He said from the highest cabinet minister to the lowliest peasant on the Antrim coast, now this is a future Labour Prime Minister speaking, he said there was no sense of war urgency at all in the region. But John McDermott, the young, vibrant lawyer who became Minister of Public Safety, he predicted that Germans would come at the next full moon and Easter Tuesday. Stormont was painted black during the war. We want to keep Stormont in the story here. It was painted black, and a lot of time was devoted to sandbagging Edward Carson's statue. There seemed to be a general belief that Hitler was determined to take out Carson, who used to holiday at spas in Germany before the First World War. And of course, when this became clear and it became known that Andrews and his cabinet had sent back the anti-aircraft guns and failed to build sufficient air raid shelters, leaving people exposed, Andrews fell and was replaced by Brooke. And we're about to see Brooke actually digging for victory, because of course this is a period where Northern Ireland's industries become important. Basil Brooke in particular, when he becomes Prime Minister in 43, he ensures that Harland and Wolff, Short Brothers, the new aircraft factory, and of course the linen mills are turning out ammunition, corvettes, flying boats, and indeed the Northern Ireland is the great breadbasket for Great Britain during the war. The war comes to an end, and of course Northern Ireland is on the brink of a major social, economic and educational revolution, as we know, because of course it becomes the beneficiary of the British welfare state, the National Health Service, free universal education, and of course free specs and false teeth, sometimes known. And of course this era will see, of course, not just the old dispensary doctors who had to pay or be insured to use, replaced by a medical and dental service free at the point of use under the Labour government. It must be remembered, of course, that the Unionist MPs at Westminster voted against the welfare state with the Conservatives under Winston Churchill, who opposed it completely. But of course, Labour had a massive majority. They pushed it on through. And Brooke and his cabinet were very suspicious of what they called creeping socialism. In a brief moment in 1945, 1946, the Unionist cabinet considered seeking Dominion status, becoming like Canada, with the Union Jack in the corner of the flag. But they very quickly realized that they couldn't afford, that this would actually break up the Unionist alliance of the upper, middle and working classes once they went it on. And anyway, British government under Clement Attlee proved to be, as they put it, practical men of affairs, and they offered to bankroll the welfare state as far as Northern Ireland was concerned. A big advantage was the 1947 Education Act, based on the Butler Act in Britain, because this enabled working class boys and girls to avail of a grammar school and university education. They passed the famous transfer exam at 11. And we can see the transformation in schools. This is the kind of late Victorian national school. And this is at Scriba, I think, in County Fermanagh, on the Fermanagh Donegal border, near Drumskinny. And of course, I mean, they were almost still using slates in the primary school, leaving at 14. A tradition in working class unionist areas in Belfast of seeking a trade in the shipyard, that wasn't really open to the nationalist population. And so the religious orders, the Dominican nuns, the priests, the Christian brothers, they began to push working class Catholics through the system into the universities by the mid-1950s. You have a massive explosion of people in Catholic grammar schools in particular, but obviously this was open to everyone, but it's very noted among the Catholic section of the community, which had always had a very small, tight middle class based on the pub trade, the license trade. So this sees the rise of the 11 plus generation, the John Humes, the Seamus Heaney's, the Mary McAleeses, the Bernadette Devlins, the Eamon McCanns, we could go on, because you have this galaxy of figures emerging in the early 1960s. What about the 50s, really, in terms of unionism? Let's have a look at 1949. We have an election sort of clip from 1949, a very bitter election, because, of course, the South had just declared an all-Ireland republic, something De Valera never wanted to do, but the coalition government of the late 40s did this. And secondly, of course, you have the fact that Basil Brooke sought assurance from the Labour government in terms of the Ireland Act. The Ireland Act reinforced partition by giving a veto to the Stormont Parliament. So we're back to Stormont there again. And here is the classic unionist propaganda of the period. Which road is yours? Brooke pointing to prosperous Northern Ireland. Éamon de Valera looking very despondent there on his shock. Somewhere about County Cavan. And then you can see, of course, playing on the border. Of course, the border had been an issue since 1921, when James Craig warned about the submergement of Ulster in a Dublin Parliament. It had never gone away. And in 1949, because of an anti-partition campaign launched by the Nationalists with the support of the Irish government, there was a unionist upsurge. Brooke has a major majority of 37 of the 52 seats at Stormont, and for the first time, there are no Protestants among the opposition. So we move into the 1950s with these benefits of the British welfare state, obviously benefiting both sections of the community. This is the 49 election, which saw violence in a number of constituencies. The old slogans are out, the bands are out on both sides, the flags are out, and of course we're moving into the 50s. And as we move into the 1950s, of course, we're into the locust decade. First of all, in the 50s, Brooke is Prime Minister. There are mod elements in his cabinet, particularly someone like Brian McConnell, who's Home Affairs Minister, who hoped to remove large sections of the Special Powers Act, who banned provocative parades in places like Dungiven. But he becomes marginalised because unionism begins to react against extra grants to Catholic schools in 1949. And the Orange Order demands and achieves the resignation of the Education Minister, Hall Thompson, at that time. And then you have, of course, in 1956, a government which is headed by Brooke, but includes at this stage, of course, it still hasn't hit the headlines. It hits the headlines, though, when Terence O'Neill becomes Prime Minister in 1963, replacing Brooke. A hands-on appointment by the governor. He wasn't the choice of the parliamentary party. That causes problems. I'm not making any allusion to present problems at Stormont, and that was the problem then. Let's just look at that piece of footage from the south, Anne, which tells us about Lemass and the run-in to the O'Neill-Lemass visit of 1965. And it's coming up now. O'Neill, of course, had been in the Irish Guards. He was brought up in a liberal background in Britain. His grandfather was a liberal Home Rule minister in the Asquith government, something he kept very quiet about when he came here. And we'll see this.
Prosperity worked its level. In the north, pre-war schemes were expanded to attract new industries with government subsidies and tax concessions. Old industries like linen, introduced centuries back by Huguenot refugees, and shipbuilding were barely holding their own. Soon, synthetic fibre and electronics plants were on their way to providing 85,000 new jobs. In the south, too, factories began to stud the land as farm workers moved to the towns. New methods not only started to make the peat bogs fertile, but made it possible to use the peat as fuel in power stations. The old, fey Irish mysticism began to submerge in the uniformities of modern industrial society. The playboys of the Western world started to clock up overtime. Then, last year, came the breakthrough in relationships between North and South. Captain Terence O'Neill, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and Mr. Sean Lemass, Éras Taoiseach, himself a survivor of the Easter Rising, the Anglo-Irish War, and the Four Courts garrison, met amicably.
So this is really the turning point. It ends a 40-year Cold War. Sean Lemass, of course, assumed power too late. De Valera had stayed too long. He has a more pragmatic policy. He abandons the old Sinn Féin protectionism, which De Valera had used to foster home industries on a very small scale. And he wants to attract inward investment. He wants better scientific and technical training to create a skilled workforce. And he wants to move Ireland, hopefully when Britain will also join, towards the common market at this stage. And of course, he's talking more pragmatically about the North, about conciliation, about practical cooperation, about burying the pike in the thatch, abandoning threats and physical force, even calling the place Northern Ireland at this stage. He's urging the nationalists, for example, to take vexed issues like the Mater Hospital, excluded from the health service for no good reason for 50 years, that they should actually take their case directly to O'Neill instead of trying to catch the ear of the Irish government. So O'Neill, this comes on. O'Neill himself, of course, wants to end the Cold War with the South and wants to improve community relations. But he's not prepared to, if you like, risk a split in unionism by pushing for immediate reforms. So he tries to improve the tone. There are civic weeks, there are cultural visits. We can see O'Neill, I think, visiting a Catholic school at Ballynahinch around 1966, which was a major breakthrough. No unionist minister went to anything Catholic. I mean, they were in the state, but not of it. That had been the system. They were a state within a state. But this is a breakthrough around 1966 when the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in his lovely Humber car arrives at the convent grammar school in Ballynahinch, being cheered by the girls. His daughter said they knew no Catholics in Ballymena or in Ahaul, where she was brought up. But here he is visiting an essentially Catholic institution, one of the products of the 1947 Act. He will watch a hockey match there. He'll exchange pleasantries with the parish priest and the nuns. And we have the nun actually commenting on, for her, the significance of this visit by a unionist prime minister and an orange man to a Catholic school in South Down. And of course, this raises nationalist expectations. Lemass instructs the Nationalist Party, now led by Eddie McAteer, a Derry accountant, to take their seats as the official opposition at Stormont, something that had been taboo from partition onwards. And they do that for the next few years, reluctantly perhaps, but under pressure from Sean Lemass, a much more pragmatic kind of response. Talks are held on tourism and all kinds of things. Nothing much eventuates from that because O'Neill didn't consult his cabinet. about inviting Sean Mass to Belfast. And he has already alienated people like Brian Faulkner, who are told afterwards about this. The key movers there are Jim Malley, who's Terence O'Neill's private secretary, and T.K. Whitaker, a County Down-born senior civil servant, who is Lemass's advisor on the economy and on the north, his native place. So that's what's happening at this stage. O'Neill is already beginning, of course, to be criticised by the right wing of his party, and outside the party by the Reverend Dane Paisley, who has been emerging slowly in the 1950s, who has his weekly newspaper, the Protestant Telegraph, and who is condemning O'Neill as a traitor to Ulster and indeed to the Protestant faith. And Paisley, at the beginning, has a minor following, perhaps. He's very much a soapbox orator outside his church, but he is beginning to become the voice of those right-wing critics, a much more articulate voice than many of them, the right-wing critics of O'Neill at Stormont in these years, as we shall see it. And of course, another key decision is taken in 1965, following the Hume, Clive, Wilton initiative in Derry, which included people like Campbell Austin of Austin Stores in the city. There is an opportunity to create a second university in the region. And they want that second university to be founded on the campus of Magee, the 19th century university college linked to Trinity. But of course, it's not to be. The Lockwood Report recommends Coleraine, a modest market town, but a unionist town. And of course, you see the cavalcade of cars now heading up the avenue to Stormont to try to persuade O'Neill and his ministers to accept the case from both sections of the community in Derry. Hume was a man who wanted it called Londonderry to embrace both traditions. But you see the cavalcade coming up now. The people who have travelled, I can see James Doherty of Doherty Sausages there, a leading businessman on the Catholic side in Derry. There's Eddie McAteer, the nationalist leader and MP. There's the unionist mayor, Commander Albert Anderson of the B Specials, and there's a young John Hume. And the idea is to put their petition. But of course, it's rejected. The university goes to Coleraine. That plus the closing of the line to Omagh and Dungannon is a death blow to Derry in the eyes of nationalists. It's very much a turning point. O'Neill has raised the expectations. They're now seen to be dashed. Very few industries are going west of the Bann. Out of 116, something like 11 go west of the Bann. And when DuPont comes to Derry, of course, the Unionist Party insist on one of their members appointing in being appointed as the personnel manager, and Brooke arranges that in the late 50s. So it is an incredible kind of situation when you consider that this is the era of the Race Relations Act in Britain, when most people are benefiting from you never had it so good culture. There are more jobs in Belfast in housing trust estates like Crega and Rathgone. 30% of the residents are Catholics, most of them working in reasonable jobs in manufacturing and the civil service. Partition seems a long way off in the 60s. But things are changing rapidly. And of course, as agriculture shrinks, Catholic poverty on the land increases. And of course, these young graduates who have been demanding a new political direction are also emerging. They're becoming tired of the old nationalist party with its kind of bishops, as someone said, responsible to no one and responding to no one, as the Nationalist Party are described, this sort of rural group of notables. And we move very quickly into the civil rights movement. And we have lots of footage. I'll just show you a couple of final bits of footage here. We move not to the big one. The first civil rights march was from Coal Island to Dungannon in August 1968. Then you had the famous march at Craigavon Bridge, which was banned, where there was a baton charge by the RUC, which changed everything. But then we have the scene in Armagh, October 1969. And we can see the rising kind of force of civil rights at this period. On one hand, you have the students, the national civil rights marchers, which was a blend of the old Republican movement, which had called off its campaign in 62. You had Labour, you had socialists, you had student marchers, you had middle-class Catholics on the ground here in Armagh. You can see it there at the Market House. And of course, Éamon Paisley had a counter-march as well. One of the ironies, of course, is that Dr. Paisley in these years denied the nationalist grievance over civil rights, but in his final interview with Eamon Malley, acknowledged gerrymandering and discrimination, which, you know, was a remarkable acknowledgement towards the end of his life. But here we have the scene in Armagh. You can see the befuddled faces of the RUC. At this stage, the RUC Inspector General, Sir Albert Kennedy, informed the Minister of Home Affairs, William Craig, who had banned the march in Derry, calamitously, as you know, he warned him that this was not an IRA front. It was a genuine demand for electoral reform. If it wasn't granted, it could lead to civil war. The civil rights movement is becoming bigger and bigger, formed by the McCluskeys and Dungannon, the campaign for social justice in the mid-60s. It has really grown now. Parades are being held every week in different places. But after October the 5th, the Labour government of Harold Wilson summoned the Prime Minister, O'Neill, Faulkner and Craig to London and told them reforms would have to come in. You have the points system for housing, the review of the Special Powers Act, the abolition of the old London Dairy Corporation, a move towards PR, all of an ombudsman to look into complaints about appointments. All of that is underway. Nonetheless, civil rights doesn't end right away. There is the student movement PD, their march from the long march from Belfast to Stroke City, the ambush at Brantollet, the rising tensions, the growing role of Ian Paisley on the anti-O'Neill side. And we move very quickly to that explosion in 1969, the explosion, of course, which would see 7 lives lost in Belfast, the Battle of the Bogside first in Derry, the trouble in Belfast, where the RUC told the Stormont Tribunal that they thought there was an IRA insurrection, where the nationalist community felt that they were being subjected to a pogrom. And of course, Jack Lynch's broadcast, moving troops to the border, James Callaghan threatening a transfer of security from Stormont to Whitehall. And of course, troops finally brought in to Derry struck London Derry on the 14th of August. Violence occurs in Belfast that night, in West Belfast. And of course, in the end, troops are deployed there the following day as whole streets burn. And we move very quickly from these scenes to what happens, because of course, the GOC is now Sir Ian Freeland. He now shares a joint security committee with Stormont politicians like Faulkner and the junior Minister of Home Affairs, John Taylor, then in his very early political career. And we move very, very quickly from that to what's happening in the streets of Belfast, the construction of the first peace line in September 1969. We just get a sense of this because the situation has gone beyond control, the control of politicians anywhere. We're moving into a situation where, indeed, land is being staked out, barbed wire barriers are being formed. And we can see this on Dover Street between the Falls and the Shankill Road. Ironically, the documentary which produced this footage in September 1969 recalled that a British Army machine gun post was at the same point in 1921, marking a peace line then. So it's a replay of those sectarian and disruptive events of, 50 years before as the peace line goes up. So we have a sense of, the first peace wall that would soon be replicated across the city and elsewhere. You would have no-go areas. The vigilantes of 69 would morph very quickly into paramilitary organizations. You had the split in the IRA as the militants accused the old guard of doing nothing to protect Catholic areas. The rise of the provisionals, the launch of their violent campaign in 1969, the emergence of the loyalist paramilitaries, the UDA and the UVF, the launch of their campaign. And so we move on. And of course, we know what happens next. We know that Brian Faulkner, whom we saw in John Hume's film, promoting the Northwest, will of course become Prime Minister, the last Prime Minister in March 1971. It's the gambler's last saloon. He proposes to Edward Heath on the 5th of August that the only way of dealing with the scores of explosions which the IRA have launched in recent months is internment without trial. But Heath warns Faulkner, if you introduce internment and it fails and alienates the Catholic population, now nearly 40%, you will have direct rule within months. And of course, that's what happens. The fall of Stormont in 1971, after Bloody Sunday, of course, the events in Derry. And here we have the great protest, because Stormont had become more important to the Unionist community than Westminster as their parliament. And now it is being prorogued, effectively in its old form, disbanded forever. Let's just see these footage. Brian Faulkner with a recovering John Taylor. He'd been badly wounded in an official IRA attack a few months earlier. Roy Bradford in the back, Herbert Kirk, that old cabinet of 1972, Harry West, they're on the balcony. And Faulkner says, I don't think we have his voice, but he says to the audience, my friends, we not only share your, we not only understand your views of betrayal by the British government, we share them. This is the end of Stormont. The coming years will see the government white paper, the attempt to establish a power-sharing executive and a Council of Ireland in 1974, the Ulster Workers' Strike, the in quick succession, the Constitutional Convention, where unionism passes its report calling for majority rule, the long wilderness years, the prior assembly of the 80s, the all-party talks of the 90s, eventually, of course, the Hume Adams talks, the ceasefires, and indeed the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement of 1998. We've tried to cover a lot, maybe so much. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank Anne. It's amazing the way she's dug the stuff out. We did a rehearsal yesterday, and it's been absolutely brilliant. And to thank everyone else involved. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Éamon, once again, and Ann. And I want to add my thanks to both of you again for a fantastic lecture this evening, and well documented as well. Covered an awful lot, 5 decades actually, and more. So a lot to be thinking about, and a lot of information to take on board. We're more than happy, I think, for a few minutes, if anybody wants to make a comment or to come in to ask any particular questions. If not, obviously you have a lot to think about, and obviously we have this 4 lectures, if you like, this particular series of scheduled lectures led by Éamon and Ann. Those have been very, very important, and we're going to review this in the time ahead to see if we want to do any more and later in the year. But for now, this is the last of the 4 scheduled lectures that we had planned and organised, and I think we covered what a breadth of information and historical perspectives from a wide range of angles. So if anybody wants to see, I'll just check the chat box. We have, I think, of a comment here. Okay, just we have a thank you to yourself from one of our contributors, Melissa McHugh. Actually, thanks both Éamon and Ann for their comments as well, or for the lecture and the standard of it and the quality of it. I'm waiting to see for a moment, Éamon, if you don't mind, if anybody else comes in the chat box.
No,
if not, we'll move on and close the event. As I say, so look, if we're happy enough.
Speaker, just there's one from Paul Nugent there.
Paul, that's Paul. Is it Paul from Connecticut?
Yeah, it just said, what, if anything, would Lemass and others in the Republic government in the early mid 1960s have done better?
Well, I think the main problem was that Lemass inherited power too late. You know, he was coming near the end of his period of active life, really. I mean, he died in 1971. He was a chain smoker. And had he assumed power a decade earlier, perhaps after the Second World War, things might have been very different. Lemass certainly was a pragmatist. Although he was involved in the Rising and was a veteran of that period, he had much less baggage, and he would have shared very much the view of someone like Ernest Blythe, that the best way to unite Ireland was to stop talking about it and to collaborate on all kinds of practical issues. And certainly O'Neill was on less firm ground. He was more remote from his cabinet. He was installed by the laying of hands by the governor. He didn't really had Faulkner become prime minister after Cropper in 1963. A man who was educated in the South, who knew Kildare Street, who used to go on a Sunday with his friend Senator Michael Yates, the son of the poet William Butler Yeats, and they were boarding at St. Columba's College Rathfarnham in the 30s. And they used to go and ask for a tram to Kingstown. We want to go to Kingstown, and the Kingstown is now Dunleera, of course, since 1922. And the conductor would say, "There is no Kingstown, it's Dunleera." And they used to go. Faulkner knew the South well, had been educated in the South, spoke a bit of Irish, actually answered Jim Sullivan of the IRA in Irish when he was heckled on the Falls Road, as I remember well on television. So, I mean, that might have worked better. Faulkner showed pragmatism later on. But you're talking about the 60s, by the way, when the Belfast Telegraph poll in 1967 claimed that 70% of people thought they would see a united Ireland within 15 years. It does seem incredible. That you had that kind of polling coming up. It wasn't terribly scientific. O'Neill was Irish Man of the Year. So I think the problem was not Lemass's heart. which was in the right place in terms of building bridges to the north. And he actually injected a realpolitik into nationalism. He was on the same page as Hume, rather than the old guard of Eddie McAteer and Joe Stewart, the old nationalist sort of notables. But of course, he didn't really have time to develop it. And you can see it in this policy, his trade agreement with Britain in 1965, his moves towards joining the common market in the 1960s, and all of that. But O'Neill very quickly was in trouble, post-Lemass being attacked by his own right wing, by Ian Paisley in particular, and suddenly on a very slippery ground and failing to win a commanding majority in the 69 election, which meant that really he then lost office, and you had a series of prime ministers, resulting in Faulkner's last chancellor.
Thank you, Éamon, for that. And we have a question from Roy White. And Roy asked, was there any history of discrimination carried out by the Northern Ireland Housing Trust?
It's pretty good. The Housing Trust actually was led by a Quaker called Sir Lucius O'Brien, that everyone had a very good word about in the 1940s and 50s. And O'Brien certainly wanted the Housing Trust to provide houses for those in need, good quality housing. I mean, we tend to forget that in the 1950s, you know, housing teams from West Germany and Belgium actually visited the Crega estate in West Belfast, and also Merville Garden Village in the Newton Abbey borough, because they wanted to see these new houses with gardens, with bathrooms, you know, which were state of the art at the time. Now, it was in one of these housing estates, of course, that Bobby Sands lived in the 1960s in Rathcoole. Many Catholics lived in Crega, many Catholics lived in Ballybean at that time. But of course, that would all change with the biggest population movement in Western Europe in the period 1969 to 72. I mean, that was the end of that kind of mixed housing. So the Housing Trust did a good job. The problem was that in those critical councils, we're talking about 6 councils, which wanted to maintain the old hegemony of unionist rule, gerrymandering, discrimination. They had a free rein. I mean, Brian Faulkner gave them cover in the 50s. That's why you had the business vote. That's why you didn't have one man, one vote, which was a derogation from the Westminster norm. And the upshot of that was that it meant that the efforts of the Housing Trust were being excluded from towns like Enniskillen. And, you know, towns like Lurgan, leading to massive local problems and protests. And if you look at the civil rights marches were, you know, they were focused in these areas where housing was a burning grievance, as in Derry, where Emily Cannon, Derry Housing Action Association, you know. So they did a good job. It was mainly in the big conurbation of Belfast. They built the Twinbrook estate, remember, the Housing Trust, as a model estate where Catholic and Protestant would live with a house and a happy family, cheek by jowl. That was the idea. But of course, it was being wiped out on those bloody, tumultuous years after 1968.
Thank you, Éamon. And I think that would end our session this evening. We have a number of people that are thanking Éamon and Ann, as I've said previously. Very good commendations from a number of commentators there, which is very, very good. And I certainly will share that on behalf of everybody. On behalf of the Assembly Commission, could I then say that that now closes, if you like, our event for tonight and ends the session, this lecture tonight, and ends the scheduled series of 4 events that we've had now in the last number of weeks. And I would hope that, and I think I'm very confident saying, certainly the feedback that we've received is that people have gained a lot of information and a lot of good understanding from the lectures presented by Éamon in particular. Just the breadth of information has been wonderful. The illustrations also, again, very, very much supported that. So again, I just want to thank Éamon and Ann, and thank all of those who have attended, not only tonight's session, but the previous ones as well. Again, I think Éamon has helped us to reflect on what is obviously a very shared history in a balanced and entertaining way. And I think that there is great merit, I think, in considering, and for ourselves, and probably all of us, to consider any further opportunities that may be perhaps available to us to conduct this type of reflective discussion and lecture and information given in our wider society. So I think it's been a great benefit to all of us. And as I say, from the Assembly Commission's perspective, we will have a look and see if there's any other seminars that we can maybe bring forward in the time ahead. I think we may well find that we'll institutionalize these in some shape or form, because given the kind of benefit that we get from it. So on that note, again, I'd like to thank Dr. Éamon Phoenix and Ann Donelly from NI Screen for the fantastic lectures that they have provided for us in the last number of weeks. And on that note, then we'll conclude tonight. And thanks very much for everybody attending. And we hope you've all gained some information and knowledge and wider information than you had before you started listening in. So on that note, then, Ihawa and good night to everybody.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, the whole team. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye.